101.6 KXLA, all aberration radio all the time.
And most of what's shown of the fair are still photographs. The flicker of the projector brings them to life a little bit, but they're just photos, and there's not much new in that.
It's going to be the biggest fair ever held in this country. My father was talking to the World's Fair Commission yesterday, and they estimate it's going to cost a cool $50 million. That's a lot of kale.
Oh, I can hardly wait to see what they've done to Skinker Swamp.
Yes, it must look like a fairyland.
Oh, no, wait, not quite. It's still a little rough. After all, the exposition doesn't open for 6 months.
History hoaxers. Well, who are they? Who were they? Well, if you saw this video entitled History Hoax that I did a little while ago, you'll recognize some of them. And one in particular actually admitted to being part of the St. Louis Expo as well as the Chicago Exposition. Each of those expositions, as with most of these World's Fairs, are, as I've pointed out, along with others, something meant to cover up the past by hiding things in plain sight and then disposing of them. The reason many of us are suspecting somewhat ulterior motives or foul play as far as these World's Fairs goes has to do with several factors, one of which is when you look at these things, they are immensely beautiful. It's like having a Walt Disney World, except way better, just for a few months, 1 year, and then bulldozing it, destroying it. It doesn't make sense. The reason I think they do it is that there was a previous civilization that built these structures, and they have trouble explaining it to the orphans who populated these cities. I believe there was a group of what I call controllers who went into abandoned, already built cities and took credit for building them by teaching false stories and narratives to a population of orphans who are brought in.
Are we all here?
Oh, just too bad for those that aren't.
From all over different parts of the world under false pretenses, and then raised up to populate the city. The evidence is coming from mainly photographs, but, well, there's a lot more evidence than that. Initially, it was the photographs, but since then, it's been found in documents. It's been found in logs, ship's logs, things like that. If you've seen the other videos, I really recommend watching the one I did on Christchurch to understand where I'm coming from on this. I looked at Christchurch, New Zealand, and the evidence I found is overwhelming. Another great one that I did was Des Moines, Iowa. If you don't understand mud flood, if you don't understand what I'm talking about here, if you don't understand the history hoax, the mystery history, the orphan trains, the depopulation, repopulation, reconstruction, reset events, and you want to really have a scholarly, solid look at it with evidence, logic, well explained, in depth but not dry, at length but not too long. The videos I did on Christchurch, New Zealand, and Des Moines, Iowa, will give you well, it'll get you maybe 80% the way there. You could probably watch 10-hour-long videos on mud flood and be primed about the same way as these 2 videos, which are, I think, each under an hour, like, I don't know, 40 minutes each. And then if you want a bonus one to kind of shock you, you should watch the one I did on the Statue of Hoaxery, the Statue of Liberty. You think you know about these things. It's right there in plain sight. And I guarantee you, when you watch the video on the Statue of Hoaxery, even if you live in New York City and you think you know everything there's to know about that, you will learn something on that video. I guarantee it. Hell, the curator of the, you could be a docent or whatever, and you'll probably still learn something if you watch that. I dug up some information on what was there before, and it was hard to find, I'll tell you that. It was very hard to find. But anyway, today we're looking at St. Louis, the World's Fair, the exposition, the architecture that has been exposed, and it needs to be put in repose before it's disposed of. And that's what they did. And the controllers, I call them, the ones who ushered the orphans from the orphan trains, ushered the orphans off the orphan wagons and dispersed them to households. They are the ones who are determining where the World's Fair is and how it's operated. They organize it. They cordon off the area, present all this stuff as if this and as if that. They create the narrative, and then they destroy the evidence. I have yet to see any valid reason why these World's Fairs would have been destroyed. If you think of it as like a carnival or a fair,
Can I go again, please?
And compare it to today.
I got you, buddy. Hey, who's this chick over here? Is that your girlfriend?
You should see my girlfriend. You shit yourself.
And then you think of it as Disney World and compare it to today. Nothing fits, because at Disney World, it's a huge moneymaker. It's a permanent installation. It's meant to last. It's built to last. But if you go behind the scenes, you will find plaster and wood and things like that. You'll find kind of junky construction, but it looks good from the outside. And that's what they'd like you to think these World's Fairs are. I'm here to tell you that's not how they were. They were built solid. Steel, sometimes stone. It often looked like stone. There was a lot of marble, a lot of softened stone, which we don't fully understand, with it's shaped and formed. It looks like it's sculpted, but it probably wasn't. You just don't sculpt marble like stone typically. It's not easy. It was probably more of like a polymer. But anyway, that's another story. So you have that, Disney World, where it's not comparing to these old structures. And then you have what they're telling us it is, like a carnival. And you have carnies, carnival workers, we call them carnies.
I was born without the top of my skull, and I guess a little bit of my brains was showing. It's grossing everybody out. So my mom put this wig on me to cover it up, and then the bones grew together, got all infused and entwined. I mean, I don't mean to get all scientific or whatever.
Carnies slapping together the lightest, junkiest crap that barely even holds up under a gust of wind. And it's up for a while, and people go and they have fun, and then it's torn down. You compare that to these structures, and again, it's even greater of a divide. So you could attribute it somewhat to a learning curve, I guess. But when you look at how people reacted, I don't think we're getting the whole story. I think people were probably somewhat shocked and outraged at the tearing down of these places. But then again, who were the people and how many of them were there really? Well, not as many. The populations of these cities never seems to justify the structures in place in the photographic record. Don't assume that the people are invisible because they moved. I have photos of horses walking and things like that from the 1850s, and photography didn't need to do 1 and 2 minute long exposures. The populations were just not as high. And the people, again, they may have been less suspicious because many of them were orphans who were raised by the people controlling the narrative.
It's going to be the biggest fair ever held in this country. My father was talking to the World's Fair Commission yesterday, and they estimate it's going to cost a cool $50 million. That's a lot of kale.
Oh, I can hardly wait to see what they've done to Skinker Swamp.
Yes, it must look like a fairyland.
Oh, no, wait, not quite. It's still a little rough. After all, the exposition doesn't open for 6 months.
Or the people raising them were under the thumb of the people controlling the narrative, the ones who owned everything, the ones who basically inherited what was already there and were in charge. You really couldn't go against them. They had, well, true to their name, I've given them tight control over basically everything that was going on, especially the narrative. And the history needs to be, well, reevaluated, let's say.
Well, here we go. All aboard, everybody.
Chug, chug, chug with the motor.
But I think what we have tonight is a little bit out of the ordinary anyway. 100 years ago, April 30th, 1904 to be exact, the gates to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition were open to the public. 100,000 people came just for the opening ceremonies to listen to the speeches, and millions would come in the next 7 months. Tonight, our stories are not so much about the World's Fair, but the World's Fair City. As St. Louis moved from the 1800s into the 1900s, there was a lot of work to be done. The city had been chosen as the site for a World's Fair, finally. St. Louis had made a pitch 10 years before for the Columbian Exposition. Bad enough they didn't get it. Worse, that it had gone to rival Chicago. And both mayor and governor was head of the fair committee. The planners chose Forest Park from among a number of sites. When the trees were cleared, it would be a clean slate, far from the heart of the city. Yet still, St. Louis itself would be on display to the world, and that presented some problems. Smoky skies, unpaved streets, slums, political corruption, to name a few. Now, David R. Francis, political corruption, who had been both mayor and governor, was head of the fair committee, and there were those who'd been trying to deal with some of these problems, and now with the fair, the social reformers and the civic boosters found some common ground. At the very least, the most glaring problems might be solved and St. Louis made more presentable to the world. It couldn't be business as usual anymore. And in 1901, people elected as mayor Rollo Wells, a wealthy businessman who had promised to bring about a new St. Louis. It was here, on Lindell Boulevard, that Wells kicked things off. In 1901, this was the new home of the exclusive private St. Louis Club. And the new mayor invited politicians and business leaders for a formal dinner and a World's Fair pep talk.
It is my opinion that there is but one way to accomplish this end, and that is by cooperation. With that spirit prevailing, there can be but one result, and that is a new St. Louis.
Talk of unity and cooperation was appropriate in 1901, partly because 1900 had been a terrible year for St. Louis. It was a time when people had taken up arms against each other, fighting for the very control of the city streets.
Sounds a story which cannot be verified. This is legend.
A battle that left damage, injury, and death.
There's this notion that there's no class conflict in the United States. I don't know how you can look at the 1900 streetcar strike and say there was no class conflict in the United States, and certainly in St. Louis, workers would have thought that was a foolish statement in 1900 or even beyond that.
Turn-of-the-century streetcar workers had familiar gripes: long hours, low pay, no job security, and a company that refused to recognize their union. The streetcar company, which kept the city moving and growing, was a monopoly run by wealthy men living in the West End. In the North and South Side working-class neighborhoods, the transit company was known for poor service, arrogance, and disdain for its customers and their safety. Both sides dug in on principle. They knew the issues went beyond one company and its workers.
This was not only a strike about control, reduced working hours. They did call for a 10-hour day. It had radical goals.
The strike began May 8, 1900. Workers and supporters immediately moved to try to shut the system down. They piled rocks on the tracks and built barricades. They strung on the overhead trolley lines all kinds of things: pots and pans, shoes, even the stuffed dummy of a scab. Strike supporters threw rocks, threatened and beat up riders. Some women riders had their clothes ripped. It was dangerous business trying to ride a streetcar in a working-class St. Louis neighborhood.
Workers in St. Louis really identified with the idea that they had the right to control the streets in their neighborhood. They may not be able to control their workplace conditions, which was more centrally located, but they had the right to control the streets. They had the right to shut down the streetcar lines. They were completely shut down in the north side and the south side by this working class activity.
Strikers organized a boycott, and it was effective. People walked. The streets were filled with all kinds of horse-drawn vehicles, some supplied by the union itself. On the other side, a posse was organized from among St. Louis's wealthier citizens. The legal justification was the need to keep running the streetcars which carried the U.S. mail. On June 10th, a month into the strike, there was a confrontation downtown between a parade of strikers and the posse. The posse fired into the crowd, killing 3 people. This is how the new century was ushered in the city chosen to host the World's Fair. The strike dragged through the summer. Support for the boycott faded, and it was all over in September.
That's one direct outcome, is that they had peace and quiet during the fair, in large part because the elite actually recognized some unions. These were primarily skilled trades unions. And in turn, many of the unions made sure that there were no strikes during the course of the fair. In fact, unions might have effectively, had this 1900 strike not happened, they might have effectively shut down the fair and spoiled the whole thing.
So they take the one picture of them building some crap wood structure, and then they take another picture of the some object that they can't even lift, much less build, from the World's Fair, and they superimpose the exposure, masking part of the picture of the one, leaving it blank, and then that's how they Photoshop back then. Then they take the other negative from the picture they took of some object that's going to be featured in the World's Fair, and they fire that onto that paper with the one area that was masked before, now with all the other area masked, and then they expose it and try to match it up, which they did a horrible job of doing and then the double exposed single print goes out as a piece of history, and it's totally fake. It's photoshopped and it's obvious.
Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. Don't tell me the lights are shining any place but there. We will dance the hoochie coochie. You will be my tootsie wootsie if you will meet me in St. Louis, Louis. Meet me at the fair.
Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. Don't tell me the lights are shining any place but there. We will dance the hoochie coochie. I will be your tootsie wootsie if you will meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at...
For heaven's sake, stop that screeching.
Well, not too long ago, they were helping Channel 9 track down some old stuff for our 50th anniversary this year when they came across something they didn't know they'd had.
And one of the items happened to be a pair of reels that said World's Fair Deloge. That's all. Reel 1, Reel 2. We put them up on the viewer and turned on the switch, and oh my gosh, what have we got here? Is this honest to God World's Fair footage that nobody has seen before?
That's the World's Fair, all right, the Cascades, moving pictures, the real thing. But there's already known film of the fair. The question was, are these scenes that they didn't already have? The film clearly stated that it was looking back on the event nearly 20 years later, and most of what's shown of the fair are still photographs. The flicker of the projector brings them to life a little bit, but they're just photos, and there's not much new in that. What really jumped out at the historians was the moving images of the ceremonial driving of the first stake in Forest Park in 1901. Another clip shows the groundbreaking kicking off construction. And there's the famous pressing of the button by David R. Francis to officially open the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904.
You know, there were plenty of oohs and ahs, and then we started, okay, let's take a really close look at what we've got here.
And these historical society folks know the World's Fair as well as they know anything. They've got plenty of photos of the important events, and they immediately saw the discrepancies. Different clothes, different weather. And that's David R. Francis, all right, but an older, grayer David R. Francis. So it was a long-lost film. But of the actual World's Fair events,
we found that it wasn't actually. It was a recreation from the early 1920s, from 1922, about 18 years after the fair had closed. But it took us some effort to get to that point, to sort of discover. So for a period of time, we had this sense that, oh my gosh, we found the lost, missing link of the World's Fair, and then it slightly adjusted.
The film historian saw other signs that put the events at a later date. Film techniques, this dissolve from a wide angle to a close-up, for example. The kind of thing that just wasn't being done in 1904. And someone else remembered running across something in the archives, a clue that seems to put all the pieces together.
One of the librarians remembered an article in a newspaper about a film being made recreating the opening of the fair. It was a Post-Dispatch article in 1924.
That was the 20th anniversary of the World's Fair. The article said a film was shot 2 years before when the surviving World's Fair committee members had held a reunion. It said the film had been shown in movie theaters and was now going to be shown again to civic groups.
You would have assumed that there would have been some organ, some music being played at the same time, but to a modern viewer, you couldn't possibly sit through these things. There's the absence of color, there's the absence of sound, and then of course there's the extremely slow editing pace.
And a long time to read the titles.
The titles are on the screen for an awfully long time. And not only are we more accustomed to a quicker editing pattern, we're accustomed to a wider variety of shots. You have increasingly, as we approach the 1900 mark, a growing professional class of teachers. We're beginning to have physicians, lawyers. You also have an upper class community of African Americans in St. Louis that have always been here since before the Civil War.
The clubs in St. Louis drew the great ragtime artists, and Scott Joplin was publishing his rags and selling them all over the country. Government was a problem. The impressive new city hall was riddled with corruption. The most powerful man in politics didn't even have an office here. He wasn't appointed or elected to anything. He was just the boss. Muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens embarrassed St. Louis in his nationally published writings on corruption. He said that St. Louis was making two announcements to the world, one that it was the worst governed city in the world, the other that everyone should come there for the World's Fair. In the years leading up to the World's Fair, the papers were filled with headlines of investigations, disappearing suspects, confessions, grand juries, and trials. 24 politicians and businessmen were indicted. As for Joseph Folk, or Holy Joe as some called him, his anti-bootling crusade got him elected governor of Missouri in 1905. Mayor Wells had kept his distance from Folk's brand of reform. Instead of cleaning out City Hall, the mayor was busy paving streets, putting in streetlights, and building sewers, and tackling a problem that affected everyone in the city, from the poorest slum dweller to the richest West End millionaire. St. Louisans had long lived with, cooked with, drank and bathed in dirty water. But until the World's Fair came into the picture, nobody seemed to mind that much.
I remember my mother saying to my father, just let it run, and it'll finally clear up. I guess sometimes they'd leave it run a half hour.
Nobody seemed to mind that much.
And it'd still be muddy.
Nobody seemed to mind that much.
This became a particularly pressing issue at the turn of the century because St. Louis was about to have a World's Fair. And water was going to be an important component in this World's Fair. They had planned to decorate the fair with lagoons, with waterfalls, with fountains. How would it look to the rest of the world if there's muddy water pouring out of the statuary?
And there was still plenty of dirt in it when it was pumped to the water towers and then throughout the city. A panel of experts looked at two solutions, building a filtration system or finding a new water source. But neither proposal met Mayor Wells' budget restrictions or his deadline. Whatever was done had to be in place by the World's Fair. So they tried something new, chemicals, coagulants, which pulled the dirt out of the water, and it cleared up. And even though they had to cut back on the chemicals when the seals and the fish at the fair started to die off, they got what they wanted. Crystal clear water was the visual centerpiece of the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The summer of the World's Fair, Laura Marsalek turned 10 years old.
The Cascades were beautiful. Whenever we went, we always went for the day. And of course they had so many interesting things at the World's Fairs, things that we never saw before. And it was a wonderful, marvelous place to be.
It was the result of years of planning, fundraising, and construction, and David R. Francis's tireless worldwide promotion. This was supposed to have been the 1903 St. Louis World's Fair, but there was so much to do, it opened a year late. In St. Louis history, there really is nothing else like the World's Fair. But in the bigger picture, this was one of the great fairs of the era.
St. Louis and Chicago and Buffalo and San Francisco and Omaha, they shared a great deal in their fairgrounds. even though each city will give you a different line explaining why its fair was special, and each fair was special. But the resemblances, I think, are stronger than the dissimilarities. And you're not sure where you are when you take a look at those wonderful photographs.
In the days before movie theaters, before broadcasting, this was the only place you could see the world and its people. It was beautiful, instructive, and fun. A collection of the best music, science, technology, and entertainment and food from around the world, set amid incredible gardens and dazzling views.
These were vanishing cities, and you had 6 months to see them, and that was it. That's why so many people attended. Tens of millions of people went to these fairs.
For people who lived in St. Louis, the experience of a lifetime was just a streetcar ride away. Edmund Philibert was a 30-year-old St. Louis carpenter who went to the fair 28 times, each night meticulously recording his experiences.
I made my 23rd visit to the fair today. We stopped at the wireless telegraph station. They could send messages to Chicago and several other places. After lunch, we went to the baby incubators. One baby was as small as a doll. Its hand was about as big as my thumb. We went to the Chinese village next and saw the fire eater perform the same tricks as usual.
It cost 50 cents to get into the fair, and more after that for food and different attractions, especially along the Pike, the long strip of sideshows and rides where the real fun was. The dancers, the magicians, the fun houses. There was something for everyone. One 10-year-old girl was fascinated by the Filipino natives living on the fairgrounds.
They had them in this little village out there at the fair, and I was very much interested in them. I used to tell my mother, let's go to see the villages and see what they're doing today.
The Philippines had become a U.S. possession after the Spanish-American War. On the Pike, you could pay to see a reenactment of an American naval victory using model ships. Another whole section of the fair was devoted to the Philippine history and culture. That included the Igorot village. Today it would seem unthinkable to display real people in such a way, but the fair was an unabashed celebration of Western civilization, of its superior intellectual and scientific achievements, and the firm belief that if we could spread that around the world, everyone would be better off.
We know these fairs were racially segregated, and they rested on a rather ethnocentric vision of the world. They were something, with all of their prejudices, that we are not, which is self-confident about themselves and their future.
December 1st, 1904. I made my 28th and last visit to the World's Fair today. It made me feel a little sad to think that it would soon be all over forever, for I had spent many pleasant days there. But everything must come to an end sometime. So I left the Lindell entrance for the last time at about 7:30.